Up next is Dr. Franziska Kohlt. She is going to talk about, well, actually, I need to say the title of her talk because it's so great. Something's Bugging Me, Lewis Carroll and Victorian Entomology. Dr. Kohlt is enjoying 2 fellowships. She's a Lever Whom, I'm saying that wrong, I'm sure, research fellow in history and philosophy of science at the University of Leeds, and she is the inaugural Carrollian Fellow at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where she is right now in a hotel where we're hoping has really good Wi-Fi. Fran, why don't you unmute and turn on your camera and show yourself? And by the way, Fran was very helpful in planning this conference. I asked her, hey, do you know anyone from the Oxford Museum of Natural History? And her response was, yes, Mark Carnell is your guy. He's a friend of mine. He's hilarious. He does all their educational programs. I'll talk to him for you. So that was very helpful. And she also got Laurence on board as well. And here she is now. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and thanks so much for putting this fantastic program together. I think last time we talked about this conference was actually in California, where I've just arrived yesterday. So if I don't make any sense, I'm blaming this on the jet lag.
My little jet lagged friend, yes. I bet you're going to make tons of sense. Don't worry.
I am just starting my presentation, which I hope you can all see.
Yes, we can. Take it away.
Ooh, here we go. So, thanks so much for still being with us. This has been a day of absolutely fantastic presentations. So many different things. So I'll take you back from the very visual to something a little bit different. And I want to talk about bugs. So here's my disclaimer. If you really do not like bugs, please go away now. There's going to be bugs. In case the title does not imply that. So bugs, why do I want to talk about bugs when we're talking about Alice and Lewis Carroll? This is a great event called Field Guide to Wonderland. And I think every single one of us had got a certain vibe when they read that. Field guides are something that a lot of us would have encountered in their childhood. They're a very particular thing. They often tell us about a certain area, its flora and fauna. They're fun, they're educational, they get us involved, and they're totally a Victorian invention. Americans, you can fight me on that later. And a load of them were on bugs. So the reason I want to start my discussion of bugs in Lewis Carroll here today is that we very often have a very specific idea of what field guides were about, and that idea is often that they are fun and entertaining, informative and innocent. And I absolutely loved how Scott started his discussion with the Book of Knowledge, sort of same type of literature. But that is not quite the whole story. And I first want to go a little bit into that story before I get back to Alice. So let's start with a little history lesson. Back in the 19th century, natural histories, that was kind of what those field guides were called then as a genre, were a huge market, and huge and very competitive market, in which a lot of publishers tried to get a foot in, and a lot of publishers with very, very different ideas. They were extremely influential as a genre. They were extremely popular. They reached a lot of different people. And they really shaped in the 19th century, which we often think of as an age of science, the sort of public understanding of what science was, who got to take part on it, who got to shape scientific knowledge, and who got to define and distribute what science actually was. It was also a really interesting age in terms of publishing. We got steam engines which made book print a lot faster and a lot cheaper, which as a result came in lots of different formats. We could experiment a little bit with what these books looked like, and sometimes people are really surprised some of these books were colorful. Like later in the 19th century, we actually get colorful books. So they also not only came in a whole range of formats, but they also contributed significantly to what I'll call very boringly the democratization of knowledge. And by that I mean bringing education, scientific education, sort of educational scientific literature to the masses. And why that's important is that those reached not only some middle class audiences, but started reaching working class audiences, audiences in the empire, but most notably children. So this whole thing dovetailed with an expansion of education in the 19th century, of which, and I'll come back to that, Christian Sunday schools were really important. And what that meant in a nutshell is that we had more books and more people to read them for more diverse audiences. So what was so special about natural histories? They were widely considered the most appropriate genre for general literature, and especially literature for children, because of their supposed neutrality. So after all, we're just talking about bugs and plants, right? There couldn't possibly be anything more to it. So let's look at who the main players in this field were to assess whether that actually holds up. So Christian presses were actually behind the bulk of published natural history texts. And when I give public talks, audiences find this often surprising because of this idea that the 19th century was an age of science, and then along came Darwin and no one believed in God anymore. But still, this is the main publishers of natural histories at the time. So publishers like the Religious Tract Society or the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge had absolutely massive audiences. And the reason I mention especially the SPCK, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, was because Lewis Carroll later in life actually funded them and supported them financially. So by his subscriptions. So we then also get a different type of publishing, which is called the so-called dissenter literature. Those were Christian authors outside the Church of England. And while that sounds really specific, it was exactly that intersection between that type of church and the sciences that was responsible for some of the most popular and some of the most long-lasting publications in the field of children's literature, the most reprinted, and historians have speculated that this may have been because they were less overtly religious in their tone. We will come back to that also. But there were also attempts to enter this market by people who tried to secularize the field of children's literature. But again, we have very, very clear ideologies connected to this, as for here, the publications by the so-called Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, which is a great name, but these were led by the liberal or Whig Lord Chancellor Henry Brougham. So again, we have sort of very clear ideologies and very different ideologies attached to children's literature at the time, and this is all pre-Carroll. So why does any of this matter? Because we're in this diverse, thriving market, and where Lewis Carroll and the Dodson family had their preferences, where they situated themselves, and therefore who they, or later Carroll, situated himself against, is actually quite telling. So why does that matter? In literary history of children's literature, we often get the sort of general view that Lewis Carroll was, and this is sort of introductory texts for Literature 101 undergraduate courses, but in those we often get the view that Lewis Carroll was the first children's author, or at least the first to write entertaining children's literature or literature free from any sort of morality, or that he indeed rejected all existing literature of that sort, which somehow turns that existing children's literature into just an indiscriminate mass of really boring stuff. Firstly, none of that really holds up historically, but more importantly, it doesn't do justice to the intellectual scope and achievement of Lewis Carroll's work, and why he was actually so successful depended massively on a more nuanced understanding of what was actually going on in the Victorian children's literature market, and natural history was really important to that. So here ended the history lesson. So now that we've established that natural histories were a really rich and ideologically contested field, the literary choices of the Dodson family and Lewis Carroll become a lot more interesting. So as Charlie Lovett, who may or may not be here, has shown in great detail, Carroll's father really invested in education, really invested in the Sunday school movement. And so the SPCK is something that Lewis Carroll was later himself majorly invested in, so that they had publications in their house by those authors. So far, so unsurprising. But natural history works were really well represented in the Dodson household and were by well-known authors who straddled this Christian secular audience territory. And among them were Jane Marsay and Anna Barbeau. And I also find it really interesting that those are female authors. We often think, when we think of Victorian sciences, this is a very male discipline, but I'll come back to this. These two authors illustrate quite well many of the natural history publishing trends at Carroll's time. In them, we encounter a new subject, either an area like woodlands or the seashore, or creatures that live in it, typically insects or birds, or a way of exploring them, such as the microscope. And we usually get a benevolent adult character who either has a ramble with a child or a conversation with curious youngsters who ask lots of questions, and then the adult gets to explain things. But because of the advances in book print, they now came with really beautifully detailed illustrations. So we could say they were indeed books with pictures and conversations in them. So these were themselves refutations of books like we've just seen in the Society of Diffusion of Knowledge, which were really dense prose-only histories, which is the sort of book that is so dry that it can be used to dry off an entire caucus race. So when we look at what books Lewis Carroll and the Dodson family purchased, what they read, and how Carroll later wrote, we can see that rather than rejecting all children's literature in what he wrote in Alice, he actually sides with one existing genre, rejecting another. So that already gives us a little bit more to work with. So this becomes really clear when we look at how Carroll embraced this genre later in life. His library contained many natural history books, especially by the Reverend John George Wood, who's basically the best-selling natural history author of his time. These were slightly more upmarket, as you can see. Probably you can't really see the gold print, but just believe me, it's like gold embossed stuff. So very, very pretty books as well. So the whole aesthetics in these books, the whole narrative style, really tells us something about the reader expectations that middle-class audiences would have had towards Alice, which is quite important for Alice, and I'll come back to John Wood for that reason. And then bugs. We haven't really talked much about bugs, but Carroll had disproportionately many books on bugs in relation to how many natural history books he owned. And they are a really good illustration of the breadth of entomological literature that was available. So he had some of these classic natural histories by John Woods, which I just put on there. But he also had and here's a slide just comparing some of the aesthetics of Wood's natural history and some of the later Alice illustrations, but do not fear, I'll come back to those also. One of the books aimed at adult audiences that I find quite interesting, Carroll had, was Letters on Natural Histories of Insects mentioned in Shakespeare's play, with incidental notices of the entomology of Ireland. So that's really interesting, because we often see in gift shops books of the flowers of Middle Earth or the insects of this and that book. So that is a publishing genre that already started much earlier and that Carroll was interested in. He also owned, for instance, Becker's The Population of an Old Pear Tree, which is a dream fairy tale that shrunk a dreamer to dwell in an insect society. So that's really interesting. Or, for instance, Francis Burnham's Happy Thoughts, which doesn't have insects in the title, but the whole plot line is that upper class people encounter insects, and that brings out their really nasty personalities in a very similar way to the camera and the photographer does in Hiawatha's Photographing. So the final author I want to mention here is Margaret Gatty, who I know Laurence has, who you heard earlier, has written much about. So the reason I want to mention Margaret Gatty, and especially her Parables in Nature, is because it features several stories about insects, including A Lesson in Faith, which is the story of a grumpy, know-it-all caterpillar that learns from nature that it will one day become a butterfly. And the whole point of this story is that we get a natural history story, but it's a parable, there's another lesson in there, and that lesson is that the caterpillar's transformation, which is the metamorphosis that is evident in nature, is a metaphor, an analogy for the persistence of the soul after death, which we learn by studying an insect, but also that story conveys something more. Now, what's interesting about this is that we have an educational encounter, a conversation with a caterpillar that is meant to be educational. Of course, we get a similar scenario a little bit later on, because we get a caterpillar in an educational with Alice, an educational encounter with Alice, or rather a mockery of this exact setting, which is based entirely on the natural history observation that a caterpillar is not actually in a position to lecture a child at all, because it is, in relation to its own species, still a juvenile. It is not yet a butterfly, it is a caterpillar. And Carroll really rubs that in, because they're both exactly 3 inches high, and it actually needs to sit in a mushroom to be any taller than Alice. But the only thing the caterpillar does is it gives her a fast track to growth. Now, knowledge literature of Carroll's time is all about what one of the previously mentioned author called cultivating the mind of the child, in order to become the sort of adult these texts and their underlying ideologies projected. In Gatti's case, this is primarily Christian ideals, but what's important is that this message is, in Gatti, not delivered by an adult, but by a talking animal. And thus it evokes the impression of this coming not from a human, but straight from nature, which somehow gives an impression of it being more true, more the real thing, more the actual truth that is evident in nature. It's a fact. And that's quite important, because insects very often feature in Victorian children's literature as conveyors of some sort of really explicit teaching. And that's entirely in keeping with how they figure in Victorian culture and wider Victorian culture, where such values were implicitly encoded, and where they were vehicles for anything from gender perceptions to imperialism. And hear me out on that one. As we saw in Gatti, but something that happened also in more sciencey texts, is that they were portrayals of insects were very anthropomorphic, and we can here see John Woods's Homes Without Hands. So this is all about how, oh my God, look at all of these animals, they can do things so well without being like us humans, but actually also being quite like us humans, and the social habitations that really sort of inscribes natural human social systems onto animal habitations. So the interesting thing is that you then read texts which you think are neutral scientific texts or neutral scientific observations in a way that they serve as models for society. And of course, many authors wrote them exactly in that way because they knew they would be read in that way. And that's perhaps not surprising when we think about the term, and so that a lot of Victorian ideology seeped into that is perhaps not so surprising when we now think about the terms that this sort of literature shaped. When we think about phrases such as the animal kingdom, that's quite anthropomorphic. We think of invasive species and ant colonies and worker bees. So those are all very human concepts. And they are so anthropomorphic, they actually, in natural history these days, get quite in the way of understanding how some of these species work. For instance, not every bee species has this queen-worker bee relationship, even though they've become completely iconic for precisely that. We know that, we see that, for instance, in How Doth the Little Busy Bee by Isaac Watts, which Carroll famously parodies as How Doth the Little Crocodile in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, where children were to behave in relation to their superiors exactly like those worker bees to the queen bee. And that Carroll parodied that sort of stuff gives you an idea of what he might have thought of that sort of moral literature of this particular kind. So the idea that this is the story nature tells us, and therefore it must be true, of course, had massive potential for putting one's own personal ideological message into this. And this is an example from another couple of really best-selling Victorian authors, Kirby and Spencer's Entomology, which was again reprinted for quite a long time. And so what's really interesting is when you read the introductions to these works, and Kirby and Spence believe that the study, and this is a quote, of entomology is a patriotic necessity. So this is for British audiences, a patriotic necessity to study insects. And they claim that, quote, the utility of the study of insects lay specifically in the instructions they provided for manufacture. And insects in this book were portrayed as expert lace makers or as model architects. And so every patriot zoologist was encouraged to collect and classify and assess the value of every specimen. And as historian John Clark observes, their portrayal of insects was really to further a mercantile view of society. Now, this is at the time of working class riots, people and workers especially demanding more rights, more democratic participation. So it's really interesting we get books at this time that seem to suggest that there simply had to be a working class that couldn't rise up against their superiors. It's how nature would have wanted it. So those books are interesting for many reasons. So this anthropomorphism is translated even into strictly scientific dimensions. And I'm just going to check my time. I think I'm doing okay. So we get this in purely, so we could still argue that this sort of sits at the intersection of science and storytelling, but we really get this sort of value-laden ideology even in something as pure or seemingly pure as the scientific naming of insects. I usually dig out the anecdote of the red underwing moth here. They didn't used to exist in England, they now do. But when they were discovered in the colonies by a minister of the church, he was so utterly shocked by the fact that these seemingly completely grey and camouflaged insects, when scared by predators, would flash their red underwings. He was further absolutely horrified by the fact that some of the females mated with more than one male, so that the moth you can see in the left of the picture here, Catocala elocata, was in translation named the prostitute moth. So much for naming of insects being scientific, but when you look at the naming of this entire class of insects, and I'm not aware of many having changed their name in the meantime, we get the adulterer moth and all sorts of other things. So it's really interesting how we get this gender prejudice encoded into moths because of their color of their wings. But yeah, when we look at natural history literature, it really doesn't exist in a moral vacuum. It always had an ulterior note to it. And when we look, especially what sort of literature John Wood and other people published, it is really very much of its time, by which I mean it is often incredibly racist and very difficult to read. But back to Carroll. Insect encounters in Carroll's work are therefore not something that existed in a vacuum. So we had really specific reader expectations. Readers who read these natural histories would have expected, or these natural parables, would have expected some sort of educational moment to be conveyed by an encounter with insects. These were very often and almost always pedagogical, and they were exactly where authors, even in a wider work, if there's an insect encounter, that's where they would make their point ideologically. And this is where it really helps to juxtapose Lewis Carroll's portrayals of insects with the books that he kept in his library or other books that he would have read. So let's start with Through the Looking Glass. Its opening sequence is actually, when we think about it, all about education and educational literature and how children were educated. So when Alice comes into the Looking Glass country, the first thing she wants to do is she make a grand survey of the country that she was going to travel through, which is something very much like learning geography. And you can see that she's sort of rattling through geography in a way that she would have perhaps learned it. And actually, that's very, very similar to what happens in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. When Alice falls down the rabbit hole and she's completely disoriented by what is going on, she tries to remember all of the things I used to know. She tries to recall the multiplication table, again, tries to remember geography, and then she tries to remember some of the poetry, including How Doth a Little Crocodile, that might give her moral or geographical guidance. But all of the knowledge that she used to have turns out to be completely useless. And so when we see the same thing in Through the Looking Glass, when she wants to practice her geography and her mathematics to make a survey of that country, it also doesn't turn out to be quite as helpful. Now, what's interesting is the choice of subjects here and juxtaposing that with the sort of Victorian educational literature that we would have had. So John Wood, again, published something called The Boy's Modern Playmate. And if we look at the page of contents, so this is useful and entertaining knowledge for Victorian children. So what's useful and entertaining, and that sets so nicely to what Scott used in his presentation, the Book of Knowledge. Here we get optics, optical instruments, the microscope, botany. It's very close to what this conference has been doing in terms of the field guides. The next important things are entomology and photography. Again, we see how much Carroll fits into this environment. The next thing we see, survey making, surveying, also useful, entertaining knowledge for a child. Interestingly, the next thing is chess, riddles, and acrostics. So this is just to emphasize how much Carroll really fit into this publishing context. Again, the next thing that happens is that Alice spots bees, and you'd think that's some prime territory to showcase her natural history and knowledge. Unfortunately, things take a slightly different turn. We know what happens next. She spots what she thinks is bees, but something is off. As she approaches them, she realizes they aren't regular bees, but elephants. Who would have thought? So what's interesting here on this quote is they are poking their proboscis into the flowers as if they were regular bees. Now, proboscis is the technical term, as I'm sure you know, for the facial appendage of both the bee and the elephant. It's the nose. And we could think this is just a joke on the phrase to make an elephant out of a fly. But once we look at the natural history books Carroll himself read, we'll realize just how closely Carroll is working with his audience expectations. You only need to read a few pages into any of these Victorian books on insects and microscopy. The proboscis elephant insect joke is absolutely everywhere, and it's right there. So here's, for instance, John Wood's Half Hours with a Naturalist, who says the inner jaws of the bee are greatly lengthened, blah, blah, blah. And they are just as the proboscis of an elephant. So again, we have the flexibility here. The bee is almost like an elephant because they both have a proboscis. It's this verbal slippage that Carroll is playing here, but a very specific example that's used in Victorian children's literature, natural histories a lot. Here's White's Curiosities of the Microscope. The fly has a proboscis as seen on the elephant's trunk. We get, I could show you 10 other examples, but it is absolutely everywhere. This is how obvious it was. But I also show you how Carroll does a lot more with this. Now, all of these authors that I've just mentioned do this particular thing, naming the proboscis and illustrating this with examples for a specific reason, namely to present the unique selling points of their types of books. This is the point at which they tell us why their books are really good and other type of children's literature, children's natural history literature is really inferior. The first big thing is scientific terminology in children's writing. Absolutely inappropriate, according to Wood and all of his fellow natural history writers that I've just shown you. They position themselves against this type of word. Their criticism is more than just of style. When they rage against the big words with which, this is a quote from Wood here, the treasures of knowledge are surrounded, discouraging young learners from studying literature, that's really serious business for these Christian authors, illuminating why Carroll maybe had a preference for their insect and microscopy books. The study of insects was important to Wood because the study of insects under the microscope humbles us. It attuned young minds to the poetry of nature's book and searching into the mysteries of creation. It enabled their eyes, and I love this phrase, see sermons in stones and good in everything, even the most maligned of animated beings, especially those creatures who bite and sting. For that reason, to Wood, there was, quote, no more interesting, fascinating, or really instructive branch of science than the history of insects. Now, this reframes really interestingly how Carroll portrays Alice's insect encounters with regard to how he apparently rejected and dismissed previously existing children's literature, especially with morals. So now, if we look again at what happens in these insect encounters before, during, and after them, perhaps we can read them slightly differently. So firstly, Alice is exactly the sort of reader group that Wood targets. The first insect that she meets in Through the Looking Glass after those bees is a gnat. And when the gnat suddenly starts speaking, Carroll does more than those children's literature authors that have gone before. He doesn't do something entirely differently, but he works with them in an absolutely ingenious way. And this is where we really get a glimpse of Carroll's brilliance in making a literary intervention in this field. He not only describes, as the previous literature, but he stages and enacts the benefits of microscopic insect literature. And he does that with all that the medium could offer him, starting with ingenious print design. The gnat, who's at first an invisible voice, a little voice, starts to speak in a smaller font size. But once Alice starts listening, it becomes, quote, the size of a chicken, and suddenly starts speaking in a larger font size, and not just a larger font size, but the same font size as Alice. They are now seeing eye to eye. Thus more prominent, the gnat gets Alice to study the local insects, the looking glass insects. And very much in the manner of the classic structure of natural histories, we imitate the encyclopedic format, for instance, of Wood's Insects at Home, whoops, which I thought I had a slide of. No, I don't have a slide of. We get habitat, locomotion, diet, and ecosystem. When we look, for instance, at the rocking horse fly, we know where it lives, we know what it's made of, we know how it moves, we also know what it eats, and so on. So that's very classic. That's exactly how we would have been introduced to lots of different insects in those books. But we also get more. We get added drama. We get conversations, but not just the Marseille-style conversations where the child has to ask an adult for its wisdom. Here we get nature speaking. It's also not Wood's microscopy where the child has to follow instructions, but the child gets to figure it out themselves. Now, Carroll does work with the elements from those well-known books, but he offers a fresh combination of them that empowers the child, but also makes the whole thing really funny. And we also see that this has an effect on Alice. So we see a change in Alice's affective relationship with the insects when she's finally introduced to them in this way. By the gnat, we get, quote, she couldn't feel nervous anymore after they had been talking together for so long. And this is just seconds after she was really anxious about insects that sting, which gnats do. And there's more. When Alice is confronted with a third and last of the looking glass insects, which is a nonsense insect, it's the bread and butter fly, but at its imminent demise, Alice actually becomes thoughtful and ponders in silence. Her encounters with insects really stimulate thought and interest. They decrease fear, and as we'll shortly see, also engender care. So we could, of course, play devil's advocate and dismiss this as an isolated incident, as a coincidence in the way in which Carroll portrays insects. But if we look beyond Alice at Carroll's other publications, it really starts becoming a theme. Before he published Through the Looking Glass, Carroll published another children's stories, Bruno's Revenge, in Margaret Gatty's Aunt Judy's magazine. Remember Margaret Gatty from earlier on? In the story, Carroll's first-person narrator drifts into a slumber to witness the whimsical fairy children Sylvie and Bruno, who we'll encounter later, at work in the forest. And the first thing he notices them doing is tending to such unloved creatures, such as beetles. And affected by the scene, the narrator concludes that if he were a beetle, he would have a beetle that had rolled over on his back. He would quite like to be helped up again. And there's actually quite a lot in this quote. So in Bruno's Revenge, we again have this change in perspective that we got in Through the Looking Glass, but slightly differently. The narrator here shrinks down to the size of an insect, being eye to eye with it by falling asleep on the woodland floor. And being eye to eye with the insects, he gains a different perspective on its life. He's affected, he feels compassion and even empathy and with an insect. And I'd like to note why that's actually quite extraordinary from a history of science point of view, because the blurring of the animal-human boundary has been addressed in Alice in Wonderland studies quite a lot. But it is interesting, very much so, that the human here empathizes with an insect, because this is just the turn of the 1870s, just on either side of the 70s, Carroll publishes Bruno's Revenge and Through the Looking Glass. And this is the time that gets really started on the anti-vivisection debate. And at the peak of this debate in the in the late 1860s, T.H. Huxley, who we already heard about today, declared really that insects were at the lowest scale of animals, which now has become very fluid with Darwinian ideas. But he says they are lower animals. At the lowest scale of animals are insects, which are likely not even like animals. They're the most unlike humans. And he says famously that they're more akin to automata, and therefore they are special amongst animals because they cannot feel pain. So they are really, in popular discourse, the animals that are most unlike humans in this newly fluid idea on the human-animal boundary. Now, Looking Glass appears in 71, and this is the time of Carroll's own nascent anti-vivisection thought and later writing. And even though most of his prominent articles appear from 1874 onwards, we can really see this thought forming, almost like Carroll is rehearsing his arguments. Now, the way in which Carroll delivers them in what I shall call his adult writing is an augmented version of what he does in his children's literature. And it employs precisely this shift in perspective, the reductio ad absurdum, the slippery slope logic, which sort of suggests that imagine you were in that position, you wouldn't enjoy being treated like that. And he does that in order to examine our empathic boundaries, to examine rhetorically constructed boundaries of empathy more rigidly. And I'll come back to that. Carroll would also write about cruelty in sports, about hunting and horse racing in particular. And these, again, are first rehearsed outside his fiction, but then later feed back into it. We re-encounter them quite prominently in Sylvie and Bruno, which I'll call the novel-length version of Bruno's Revenge, in the 1880s, so a little bit later, where he really presses home these points with a lot more candor. And this is where it's really worth reflecting on the fact that children's literature has, or what we call children's literature, really always has a double audience of both parents and children. And the way in which Carroll positions himself publicly in these debates, in the vivisection context, but also in other contexts, under his pseudonym, his literary persona, he always calls himself Lewis Carroll, really means that even he positions the more child-friendly portrayals of such concerns as vivisection as part of the same discourse. The parents would have been recipient to both. They would have read the children's literature texts and perhaps even some of the more serious adult literature, and they would have perhaps had them correspond. So we know that but we also know this doesn't just hold true for these two different types of literature. We also know that Carroll's sermons that he later preached, he preached about kindness to animals. So Alice really speaks to the Christian natural history literature for children, but also positions itself uniquely in that. Now, before I completely run out of time, I want to just come back to Through the Looking Glass one more time, because this is where the chapter that Carroll dropped from the book, A Wasp in the Wig, sits really interestingly. The chapter is really worth our attention because the wasp is kind of the epitome of the insect that Alice is afraid of at the start of her journey in Through the Looking Glass. It's kind of the epitome of a big insect that stings. But in her encounter with it, Alice appears completely transformed. Now, having met all sorts of different insects, having been lectured by one, and actually starting to feel quite friendly with it, having started reflecting on the fate of an insect that can't get the nourishment that it needs. And she's really quite concerned about it, even though the wasp is quite a nasty character. She hopes that she can be of use to him, that she can help him. She asks repeatedly, "Can I do anything for you?" And even though Alice is actually quite offended by how rude the wasp is, she's really thoughtful about it. Perhaps it's only the pain that makes him so cross. And she asks repeatedly, "Won't you let me help you?" She's pitying. And at the end, she's really quite pleased that she had gone back to give a few minutes making the poor old creature comfortable. And that sits really, really interesting on that literature on insects that is meant to humble us, that is meant to make us relate to God's creation, and even the hated creatures in it completely differently. But it's also quite interesting in all sorts of other ways. Now, Martin Gardner speculated that this chapter, which was ultimately dropped, and some people still speculate whether it's really by Carroll, but Gardner said something really interesting, that because it's like one of Alice's last detours on her journey to become a queen, this scene might have acted as a test of character of Alice's maturity. Now, reading Carroll in the context of this genre called useful and entertaining literature of his time changes a little bit the narrative around what Carroll did in his Alice. And that is something that he was, at the start, always very keen to sort of almost correct when Alice came out. When Carroll inserts the Easter greeting, which is later on inserted into copies of Alice's Adventures and Wonderland, he highlights that he's hoping to add to the stores of that innocent and healthy amusement literature. But he also reflects on why he thinks what he might have done was new, by saying that perhaps some of us some would have blamed me for thus mixing together things grave and gay. So that tells us a little bit more about where Carroll fit in this publishing market. Carroll was a lifelong educator and one with a mission, quite literally. He did abandon his holy orders because he considered mathematics his work for God. And much like his father, he was in his entire life engaged in making available new educational literature. And often they come, and he felt like he was improving on them. And quite often these works come with reflections on how he thought he was improving on educational literature. Particularly poignant here is perhaps in his introduction to the Game of Logic, in which he states the purpose of his book as teaching children to see through so-called false analogies. And this is kind of what he already did in How Doth the Little Busy Bee and its parody, where instead of learning from a sort of sanctimonious portrayal, we learn directly from nature as Alice goes on to learn from the insects. So to conclude, Carroll was incredibly aware of his publishing environment. He worked extremely closely with its themes, with its set pieces, and by cleverly playing with them, conveyed his own 2 cents on what he believed children's literature should be like. He was himself pedagogical. He was not rejecting Christian moralizing literature. He was a fan of a lot of it, but really the way in which Carroll was so successful is that he successfully improved on it in ways that people were obviously quite receptive to. He made it funny, he made it personal, it created connection. And this is actually, he did it without us noticing. So quite aside from any of the publishing environments, this is exactly how Victorian, later than Victorian authors have read Carroll. Carroll has inspired many, many nature writers, science writers that came after him. And I'm just selecting a few of these here. But in a lot of these rewritings and adaptations and parodies of Alice in Wonderland in naturalist scientific contexts, these authors disproportionately come back to the insects, the looking glass insects. And somehow there's enormous power in giving something so small and usually so hated that even in a biodiversity crisis, we might not even care about them going because we didn't like them in the first place. They are silent and they get a voice and they suddenly get to do the talking. There seems to be something inherently powerful in Carroll's portrayal of the looking glass insects that has served as such an inspiration to authors. And if you'd like to know any more about these authors or anyone else, please ask me in the Q&A. Otherwise, if you liked the presentations by me and Laurence, we've got a wonderful forthcoming book on Through the Looking Glass, which you can buy from June. And at this point, I'll finally shut up and I'll leave you with this delightful picture of some Victorian insect fashion. Thank you very much.
That is delightful, Victoria insect fashion. Oh my goodness.
And please ask me about any of these illustrations because I can give a lecture about each of them.
Oh my, I don't know which one I'd like to wear more. Well, probably the one with the butterfly wing sticking out. I mean, let's be honest. More flattering, right? So, Dr. Fran, I love hearing you speak because literally every time I'm just surprised by something. You are a master of surprising us. And the two things that stood out to me today were of course, the prostitute moths and judging moths based on backward human gender stereotypes. It's absolutely amazing. But then also I feel like you don't have to study the Alice books very long before you realize, oh, he's riffing on things of the day, like poems that children had to learn and songs, but learning that it goes so much further, that he's riffing on actual like science books and popular insect books of the day. That's just amazing to me. Now there is, let's see, the questions in the Q&A. Have you ever seen the movie Angels and Insects? I bet you have. Yeah.
Oh my God, no, I haven't.
Oh, well, it's a great movie on Victorians and ants, says
Oh, okay, I'm going to have to write this down.
You're going to have to go to the local
Despite being
Blockbuster.
in literal Hollywood, I am actually not extremely good on films.
That's true. It is very nice to have you in this time zone. Now, Edward Giuliano asks a very thoughtful question. It's very long, and I think there might have been a copy and paste issue because I have a little trouble following it. What I'm actually going to do, and we don't have a ton of time, I feel like this could be opening up a Pandora's box of bugs, is that, yeah, because I feel like this is more of a big discussion to start and not like something to just comment on briefly. But you know what I'm going to do is actually put it on the screen so everyone can read it. And so for our YouTube viewers later on, they can see it too. And then if you just want to respond to it.
Absolutely. So the point that Edward is making is that I refer to the middle class and literacy, which Edward points out was at the time was far behind the US. Now, I'm very, so this is very, very, so I hope I conveyed a little bit about how this is sort of that we're starting to get a little bit more literacy and that needs, so I'm actually Heather said so nicely that I have 2 fellowships, and one of them, my Leverhulme Fellowship, is actually precisely on the history of 19th century children's education in the very early 19th century. So very, very, very worth studying. So just to give a little bit of an overview, is that yes, literacy levels were not amazing. So when we talk about things like the sort of education that Alice would have had, this was very, very much reserved for, people of the financial status that Alice's parents would have, especially her father, would have had. However, at the start of the 19th century, we had widespread literacy in Scotland. Scotland was massively different from England because they had education, public education, which is very, very basic and very, very early on. We get initiatives such as Sunday schools, but we also get a movement that tried to introduce literacy classes to child workers. That still existed, so they would get like 2 hours of teaching them how to read and so on. So there's a fantastic book by Liz Hoyam that has just come out, which is called The Education of Things, that actually looks at radical children's literature and how much that played with the fact that children could actually read, especially those from working class backgrounds. So this is something that's really just starting off at the start of the 19th century. So Henry Broome, who I mentioned, who works primarily in the 1820s to 1840s, he's one of the people who really tried to get primary education established in England, because he himself had studied in Scotland, and he really thought, like, why is England so massively behind on this? Even the European continent was massively ahead of England there in particular. So this is a massive growing thing, but it's really interesting to see how these very, very simple publications, and some of the ones by the Religious Tract Society, by the SPCK, which were really aimed at working class children, they were dirt cheap in terms of price, but also in terms of quality, which is why we, funnily enough, don't have a lot of these, because they were so cheaply printed. They've actually disintegrated. They were often handed around factories, they were handed around reading rooms, libraries, and so on, literally until they fell apart. There were reading groups for the reason that other people who could read would read them to other people, and especially true of children. You'd get illustrations, and actually the Saturday magazine that I've put on there has this in its logo of like an adult reading to a large group of children that were not just their children, but neighbors' children and so on. So we really get this idea of children may not yet been able to go to regular schools, but we found all sorts of ways around this. And the reason I really wanted to get these early 19th century publications in there is that they were produced by movements such as the Religious Tract Society, the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, which is actually still around, because those were people that the Dodson family really would have subscribed to. Lewis Carroll quite literally did. There was this wonderful book on Lewis Carroll's bank accounts, and we can quite literally see his subscription to the SPCK going out of his accounts. And interestingly, when we talk, for instance, about Lewis Carroll's brother, who's a missionary, he would have worked with exactly that sort of literature to distribute in the colonies. So again, this is a very, very good question. But Carroll was very aware of that, and that's going to be my last point in this very long-winded question answer, is that we first obviously get a book produced for the Christmas market. So it is upmarket. It is not something that working classes could have afforded easily, at least. But Carroll was aware of this because we get a People's Edition later on. So he's like, right, I want other people to read this. And of course, later in life, Carroll donated so many copies of his book, and especially to audiences who would have been able to afford it, because he thought it could bring some cheer and something valuable to their lives. We get the whole thing where Carroll donates books to hospitals and so on. So there's a way we can think about the Victorian class system and literacy in very sort of rigid ways, but there's also a lot of pushing at boundaries going on, which makes this whole publishing genre, especially for children, so interesting, because it produced so many different things, and Carroll really was aware of them, played with the materiality of the book. So it's just a really interesting field through which to contextualize Carroll as an author, an innovator, and as an educator.
I don't think that was long-winded. I think it was exactly long enough. I think that was a great answer. Thank you so much. And thank you for being here today. I know how challenging that was with your travel going across several
I've
time
just arrived
zones.
in California a few hours ago.
Yeah,
so
everyone.
amazing.
Amazing.
Anymore.
Absolutely amazing. So thank you so much.